I had been planning that hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a short solo trip, just a couple of days out in the woods before heading back to work. I'd been pushing myself hard at my job and thought the fresh air, the quiet, and the exercise would do me good. The trail I picked wasn't the most remote one in the world, but it was far enough from towns and roads that I knew I'd be alone most of the time. That was what I wanted: space to clear my head. I got to the trailhead late in the morning, parked my car at the gravel lot, and double-checked that my pack was loaded right. I had everything I thought I would need: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, extra clothes, bear spray, and my small camp stove. I'd read that bears were around in the area, but not overly aggressive. The advice was the same as always: don't leave food out, don't cook near where you sleep, hang what you can in a bag away from camp. I had read all that before and I wasn't careless. At least, I didn't think I was. The trail wound through dense pine and spruce, the kind of woods where sunlight struggles to reach the forest floor. It smelled like wet needles and moss, the kind of smell that makes you feel like you're somewhere ancient. The dirt was damp from rain the day before, and my boots sunk slightly with each step. I could hear birds far above, though the canopy was so thick I only caught glimpses of movement when they crossed the small shafts of light that broke through. Every once in a while, a squirrel scolded me from the branches, its chatter sharp in the stillness. The hike wasn't hard at first. It was more of a steady climb, nothing too steep, but I could feel my pack dragging on my shoulders after an hour or so. I stopped to sip water, leaning against a fallen log, and felt the sweat cooling on my back. I told myself it was worth it. The farther I went, the fewer people I'd run into. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing about a mile from a stream I had marked on my map. It wasn't the flattest ground, but there was enough space for my tent. I figured I could set up there, hike down to the stream to filter water, then come back and cook dinner before it got dark. The forest around the clearing was quiet in a heavy way, like the air was thick. I thought about going farther, but my legs were tired, and I didn't want to push myself too much on the first day. I pitched my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag inside, and walked down toward the stream. The water was cold and clear, tumbling over stones in a shallow bed. I crouched down and filled my bottles, watching the way the current tugged at little strands of moss. I stayed there longer than I needed to, just listening. Felt safe. Back at camp, I set up my little stove on a rock and pulled out a packet of food I had packed. A dehydrated meal that just needed boiling water. It was some kind of pasta with meat in it, nothing fancy, but after a long hike, it smelled good. I boiled the water, stirred it into the pouch, and waited for it to rehydrate. When I opened it, steam rose up, carrying the smell of cooked meat and garlic. That's when I remembered something I'd read once. Bears love cooked food smells more than anything else. It draws them in faster than raw food or even trash. At the time, I shrugged it off. I wasn't thinking about bears standing out there in the trees watching me. I just wanted to eat. I sat on a log with the pouch in my lap and spooned the food into my mouth. It was hot, salty, and filling. My stomach settled as the warmth spread through me. By the time I finished, the sun was low and the woods were turning a deep shade of blue. I cleaned up, packed the stove away, and hung my food bag from a tree branch the way I was supposed to. The night was still. Too still, maybe. When I crawled into my tent, the silence pressed against me. Usually, I hear crickets or frogs at night when I camp, but here it was mostly the wind moving through the trees, slow and uneven, almost like breathing. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up, rolling from one side to the other, listening. Every snap of a branch outside made my skin crawl. At one point, just after midnight, I thought I heard something heavy moving in the brush. A deliberate sound, not wind. I held my breath. It went quiet again, and I told myself it was probably just a deer. Eventually, I dozed off. When I woke in the morning, nothing looked disturbed. My food bag was still hanging. No paw prints near the camp. I shook off the nerves and told myself I was just jumpy from being alone. I packed my stove, shouldered my pack, and hiked deeper along the trail. The second day was harder. The trail grew steeper and rockier. I passed areas where the forest thinned out, and I could see long stretches of valley below me. I paused often to rest, my thighs burning with every uphill climb. The weight of my pack seemed to double, and I regretted bringing extra things I didn't really need. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I found another clearing, this one smaller and closer to a ridge, with fallen logs scattered like broken bones. I dropped my pack, set up the tent, and stretched out on the ground for a while. My stomach was growling. That night, I cooked again. Same routine: stove on a flat rock, boil water, pour it into the meal pouch. The smell was strong again, meaty and sharp. I ate quickly, more out of hunger than enjoyment. When I finished, I rinsed out the pouch, hung the food bag, and sat by the tent to watch the light fade. It was darker that night. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the woods felt heavier. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to settle down. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, but I woke to a sound that froze me in place. It was the sound of something sniffing, a deep, wet inhale, close enough that I could hear the air moving. My heart started hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I stayed perfectly still. I could hear slow steps moving outside, heavy and deliberate, crunching leaves and twigs. Something brushed against the fabric of my tent, and I could see the faint outline of movement through the nylon. It was a bear. I knew it. The smell of the cooked food must have lingered on my clothes, in the air around camp. I realized too late that hanging my food bag wasn't enough. I had been cooking right there where I slept, and the scent had soaked everything. I lay there with my bear spray clutched in my hand, the can shaking because my hand was trembling so badly. The sniffing moved from one side of the tent to the other. I heard a low grunt, deep and rumbling. My throat went dry. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Then the steps grew fainter, moving back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay there, listening, every nerve in my body stretched tight. When dawn came, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. My legs felt weak, like they barely wanted to hold me. I looked around and saw the prints, huge, unmistakable. Bear tracks circled my tent. I could see where its nose had pressed against the fabric, leaving damp spots. I packed up fast. My hands shook as I stuffed the tent into its sack and strapped everything onto my back. I didn't eat breakfast. I just started hiking, pushing myself to move faster than I thought I could. My mind kept replaying the sound of that sniffing, the weight of its presence just inches away. The trail seemed endless. My pack dug into my shoulders, sweat stung my eyes, and every step felt heavier. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the bear following me. I imagined it moving silently through the trees, waiting for me to stop. By late afternoon, I was back near the first clearing I had camped in. I thought about stopping, but the memory of that night kept me moving. I didn't want to risk another encounter. My legs ached and I stumbled more than once, but I forced myself forward. When I finally reached the parking lot and saw my car sitting there, I almost cried from relief. I dropped my pack into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and sat there with my hands gripping the wheel, shaking. On the drive home, I kept thinking about the mistake I had made. I had done everything by the book with hanging the food, but I hadn't thought about how the smell of cooking clung to my clothes, to the air around camp. That was the problem. Bears love cooked food more than anything else. I had basically invited it to come closer, and if I had made one wrong move, it could have ended very differently. I never forgot that lesson. Every time I pack for a trip now, I think about those heavy footsteps circling my tent, about the sound of its breath against the fabric. I know how close I came, and I know that out there, you don't get second chances if you ignore the simple truths. Well, there was the problem. Bears love cooked butts, and I had been sitting there, cooking mine up for them like a fool. A few years ago, my brother and I went camping in Colorado. It wasn't anything fancy or planned out like a big expedition. Just a weekend trip with simple gear, a couple of sleeping bags, and a tent we'd used dozens of times before. We wanted to get away from town for a while, and Colorado has this way of making you feel small, swallowed up by mountains, forests, and silence that stretches for miles. The air always feels thinner there, sharp and clean, and every little sound carries in ways it doesn't back home. That's part of what makes being out there so memorable, but also what can make it unsettling. We had hiked in along an old trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine, the ground soft with needles and damp earth. The sky was that deep, endless blue that Colorado does better than anywhere else, with clouds that seemed to form and break apart without warning. By the time we found a spot to set up camp, the sun was sinking low, painting the treetops with a faint gold. The place we picked wasn't far from a creek, maybe 50 yards, and the sound of running water gave the whole area a calm feeling. We cooked a simple dinner on a small stove, listened to the fire crackle, and eventually crawled into our tent when the night pressed in cold and heavy. It must have been sometime after midnight when I felt my brother shifting around next to me. I was half asleep, drifting in and out, when I heard the faintest noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a branch dropping from one of the aspens, but then he nudged me and whispered sharply for me to wake up. He'd heard a twig snap, not the kind of soft crack that comes from settling wood, but the sharp, deliberate sound of something stepping where it shouldn't have. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes, sat up in my bag, and listened. The night was still except for the water from the creek and the faint rustle of leaves moving. Then it came again, another snap. Not close enough to be right on top of us, but definitely nearby, maybe just beyond the tree line. My stomach tightened in that instinctive way it does when something isn't right. We grabbed our headlamps and flicked them on, sweeping the beams through the trees and brush. That's when we saw them. Two huge, round eyes reflecting back at us from the willows. They were far apart, unnervingly large, and locked onto us with a kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. For a moment, I thought it had to be a bear. Black bears are common enough in Colorado, and their eyes catch light the same way. The animal didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The longer I looked, the more unnerving it became. Minutes passed like that, with those eyes fixed on us while we sat frozen in our tent, lights sweeping the darkness. 5 minutes feels like an eternity when you know there's a wild animal standing there, watching, deciding what to do. I could feel my heart pounding through my chest, and every muscle in my body was coiled tight, waiting for it to move. Finally, we decided to turn off the lights. We figured maybe if we didn't draw attention, it would wander away. The plan was to quietly pack up and move camp back towards some other groups we'd passed earlier on the trail. Safety in numbers, that sort of thing. The instant the lights clicked off, everything changed. There was this sudden, violent crashing sound in the willows, like branches exploding apart. Then, out of the darkness, a massive moose charged straight toward us. The ground shook under its weight, and the sound of its hooves pounding the earth was like thunder. My body reacted before my brain could catch up. I curled down flat against the floor of the tent, bracing for impact, certain it was going to plow straight through us. But at the very last second, it veered off, swinging wide around the tent and crashing past us. So close that I could hear the deep, ragged breathing and smell the sharp, musky scent of its body as it barreled by. The noise faded into the trees, branches snapping and breaking as it disappeared into the night. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I lay there shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My brother was the same, frozen in place, both of us waiting for the noise to come back, for the moose to circle around. But it didn't. It had just gone. We didn't move for a long time, too scared to make noise, too aware that something that large could turn back at any second. Eventually, we packed up camp in near silence and moved quickly down the trail with just our headlamps cutting through the dark. Every shadow looked alive. Every noise behind us felt like something was following. When we finally reached the other groups we'd passed earlier, the relief hit me in waves. Seeing other tents, other people, even just the glow of small fires, it made the night feel less predatory. But even as I tried to sleep later, I couldn't stop hearing the crash of that moose tearing out of the willows. That was the first time I felt just how fragile it is being out there, how little control you really have in the wild. But it wasn't the last. Months later, I was back home, walking one of the trails I hiked regularly with my dog. It wasn't a remote wilderness like Colorado, just a local trail I knew well. winding through patches of trees and open clearings. Usually it was busy with other hikers, runners, and people walking their dogs. But that day it was completely deserted. Rain had passed through earlier, leaving the ground damp, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and leaves. Everything felt muffled and still, like the forest was holding a secret. My dog was ahead of me, maybe 20 yards or so, her usual spot. She trotted along, nose down, tail swaying, perfectly comfortable. Then, without warning, she stopped dead. Her whole body stiffened, ears forward, tail rigid. For a moment, she didn't move, just stood there staring into the trees. Then she turned sharply, bolted down the trail back toward me, and shot past me without even slowing down. That was what made my stomach drop. My dog never ignored me, never ran like that without a reason. She didn't even look back when I called for her. She just kept running, claws tearing into the wet dirt. I started after her, confused at first, then worried. That's when I noticed it. A clear print pressed into the mud off the trail. Large, round, with a deep pad and distinct claw marks. A mountain lion track. Unmistakable. I froze, staring at it, my mind running through everything I knew about mountain lions. They stalk quietly. They watch before they strike. And they almost never let you see them before they decide what to do. The forest around me suddenly felt different, heavier. Every tree, every shadow, felt like it was hiding something. I could hear my own breathing too loud, too fast, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. The thought that one might already be watching me, ready to spring, rooted me in place. I forced myself to move, keeping my eyes wide, scanning the trees, the branches, the rocks. I knew the worst thing you could do was run. Running could trigger the chase. So I walked, steady but fast, following the trail back toward the parking lot, every muscle in my body tense and ready. The silence was unbearable. No birds, no rustle of squirrels or chipmunks, just the sound of my own steps on the damp trail. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, that same locked stare I'd felt months earlier in Colorado, except this time I couldn't see where it was coming from. When I finally broke out of the trees and into the open lot, my dog was there waiting, pacing near the car, panting hard. She jumped inside the moment I opened the door, like she couldn't get away fast enough. I sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine, scanning the tree line, waiting for something to move. Nothing ever did, but the unease clung to me for days afterward. That trail never felt the same again. I still hiked it, but always with a heavier awareness, always with a glance over my shoulder, always with the knowledge that mountain lions live in silence. And most of the time, if you see them at all, it's already too late. Those two moments, first the moose, then the lion, changed the way I thought about being outdoors. People like to imagine the wilderness as peaceful, a place to clear your head, and it can be that. But it's also alive in ways you can't control. At night, a twig snapping can mean 1,000 things, and every one of them carries weight when you're miles from safety. A moose charging out of the willows doesn't give you time to think about what's logical. It just forces you to face how fragile you really are. And a mountain lion's print in the mud, fresh and undeniable, reminds you that something stronger, faster, and infinitely more practiced in survival could be right behind you without making a sound. Out there, it isn't about conquering nature. It's about recognizing you're a visitor in a place where you're not the one in charge. And once you feel that, you never forget it. I didn't set out on that hike thinking I would have to fight for my life. That's never how it works. You go into the woods for quiet, for a challenge, for some fresh air and solitude. You tell yourself you're prepared, that you know enough to stay safe, and you convince yourself that bad things only happen to careless people. At least, that's what I used to think before everything changed on that trip. It was late summer when I decided to hike a trail I had never done before. It wasn't marked as especially dangerous, but it was deep in bear country. I knew that going in. Every guide I had read reminded me about bear safety. Make noise while hiking, carry spray, store food properly, and never run if you see one. I thought I understood all of it. I had been on enough backpacking trips before to feel comfortable, maybe too comfortable. The trail started off calm. The first miles wound through pine forest, the kind of tall, straight trees that filter the light down in broken streaks. The ground was soft with needles, and it smelled sharp and clean, like resin and earth. Every so often I would hear the rush of a creek nearby, or the chatter of a jay in the branches overhead. My pack felt heavy at first, but I was strong enough to handle it, and the steady rhythm of my steps soon drowned out any other thoughts. Hours passed like that. The trail got steeper, climbing toward higher ground, and I could feel the pull in my thighs as I pushed upward. Sweat soaked through my shirt and the straps of my pack dug into my shoulders, but I kept going, stopping only to sip water. The air thinned slightly as I climbed, cooler, easier to breathe, but there was something else in it too, an edge of tension, like the forest was holding its breath. I reached a small clearing just before dusk. It wasn't big, just enough room to set up my tent between a few boulders and fallen logs. The ground was uneven but dry, and it was close to a stream where I could refill my bottles. I dropped my pack and sat on one of the rocks, feeling the relief of weight leaving my back. My legs tingled as the blood rushed back into them. I thought about making camp there for the night, but I hesitated. It was early still, not quite dark, but fatigue won. I had hiked far enough, and the idea of pushing deeper into the woods as the light faded didn't sit right. I pitched my tent, stretched out my sleeping bag, and set up my stove on a flat stone nearby. Dinner was simple, just boiling water poured into a pouch of freeze-dried rice and meat. It didn't taste great, but it filled me up. As I ate, the woods around me grew quieter. The birds stopped calling, the air cooled, and the light shifted to a darker shade of blue. I cleaned up carefully, packed away my food, and hung the bag from a sturdy branch a good distance from camp. I'd done everything right, at least by the book. With the fire dying down and nothing left to do, I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay in the darkness listening to the night. First, it was peaceful. I could hear the faint trickle of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the hours went on, the silence became heavier. I woke at one point to a sound outside, faint but distinct, a branch breaking under weight. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, listening hard. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like something moving through the brush. I told myself it was a deer, maybe an elk, but deep down I already knew what it was. The smell of cooked food had clung to my clothes, to the very air around the tent. I remembered reading that bears don't just follow food bags. They follow the scent trails that cooking leaves behind. My chest tightened as I lay there, motionless, listening to the heavy shuffle of something big moving closer. The sound grew louder, then paused just outside. A deep huffing breath pushed through the thin nylon wall. My skin went cold. I could see the faint shape of its shadow as it shifted, broad and massive, blotting out the moonlight. I gripped the can of bear spray I had left near my sleeping bag, but fear rooted me in place. The bear circled the tent slowly, sniffing, its weight pressing into the ground with each step. At one point, it brushed against the fabric, and the whole tent shook. My breath came shallow and fast. Minutes stretched into forever, but finally, the bear moved away, its steps fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. I lay there until dawn, every nerve stretched tight, waiting for it to return. When the first light finally came, I stepped out and saw the tracks. Huge prints in the soft dirt, circling the tent. My food bag was untouched, still hanging, but I knew I couldn't stay another night out there. I packed quickly, my hands shaking, and started back down the trail. But the woods weren't done with me yet. I was halfway down the trail when I heard it again, the heavy rustle of something following. I stopped and listened. The forest went quiet, too quiet, until a low grunt carried through the trees. My stomach dropped. It was still there. I moved faster, almost jogging, but I could hear it keeping pace, the brush cracking and snapping under its weight. Sweat poured down my face, but it wasn't from exertion. It was pure fear. I tried to stay calm, to remember everything I'd read. Don't run. Make yourself big. Stand your ground if it comes close. But in that moment, all I wanted was distance between me and that animal. Then it happened. I rounded a bend in the trail, and there it was, Just yards ahead, the bear. Huge, brown, and powerful, its head low, eyes fixed on me. For a second, I froze. The world narrowed to the sight of that animal standing on the trail, blocking my way out. It huffed, stomped, and then charged. Time slowed. My hand went to the bear spray, but in my panic, my grip fumbled. The can slipped, clattering to the dirt. I lunged for it, but the bear was already on me. It hit me like a truck, knocking me flat on my back. The weight crushed the air from my lungs. Claws raked the ground beside my head as it swiped, and its hot breath blasted against my face. I thought that was it, that I was about to be torn apart. But something primal took over. Pure survival. My fist shot up, not even planned, just instinct. I drove it straight into the side of its muzzle, a desperate, clumsy punch fueled by fear and adrenaline. The bear reeled back, more startled than hurt. That split second was everything. I scrambled, grabbed the spray, and fired it right into its face. The cloud hit, and the bear roared, thrashing, shaking its head violently. It backed away, pawing at its face, then turned and crashed into the trees, snapping branches as it fled. Silence fell hard. I lay there gasping, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. My knuckles throbbed where I had struck it, a raw ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. My chest heaved, and the dirt beneath me smelled of sweat and fear. It took me a long time to stand. My legs felt like water, my pack was half torn, and the spray can still shook in my grip. I kept walking, slow at first, then faster, every sound in the woods making me flinch. When I finally stumbled back into the parking lot and saw my car, relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I threw the pack into the trunk, climbed inside, and sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the trailhead. I had survived, barely, and not because I was strong or skilled, but because of sheer luck, panic, and a wild punch that gave me a fraction of a second to use the spray. It wasn't something to brag about. It wasn't some heroic victory. It was just survival, messy and terrifying. On the drive home, I kept replaying the moment. The weight of the bear, the sound of its roar, the shocking feel of my fist connecting. I knew how close I had come to dying. I also knew I had broken one of the biggest rules by cooking where I slept, by letting my guard down, by not taking the threat seriously enough. I don't tell the story to make myself sound tough. I tell it because it reminds me how fragile life is out there, how fast things can change. Punching that bear wasn't a triumph. It was a desperate, humbling act that bought me one last chance. And that's the truth. The humblest story I'll ever tell, about punching a bear and somehow walking away alive. I had been on a backpacking trip with a small group of hikers for a few days, heading deep into the backcountry of a national forest. The kind of area where the trails were narrow, the trees pressed in on both sides, and the only sounds came from the wind, the creek, or the occasional bird. The days were filled with long hikes over uneven terrain, carrying packs heavy with food, water, and gear. At night, we camped in clearings we found along the trail, pitching tents near streams or on flat patches of mossy ground. It was exhausting, physically, but freeing in a way that only being miles away from civilization could feel. On the third night, after setting up camp in a small clearing near a creek, the group sat around the fire. The sun had just set, and the fading light left the forest dim and shadowed, the tall pines and dense underbrush swallowing everything beyond the reach of the firelight. The warmth of the fire felt comforting at first, the smell of smoke mingling with damp pine needles and the earthy scent of the creek. But then someone started talking about aliens. At first, it was casual. Someone mentioning a strange light they had seen while hiking at night, another joking about being abducted. But soon it escalated into a full conversation about UFOs, sightings, and government cover-ups. The more they spoke, the more uneasy I felt. I wasn't scared of aliens in the sense of believing in them, but there was something about the conversation, the way we were so far out in the wilderness with no one around for miles, that made my stomach twist. I finally interrupted myself, saying quietly, "Can we talk about something else?" For a moment, there was a pause. Then, without warning, the conversation shifted to bear encounters. One of the hikers began recounting a time they had almost come face to face with a black bear while hiking alone in the Rockies. Another told a story about a mother bear protecting her cubs in the forest, and yet another shared a close call on a trail where a grizzly had wandered through a campsite. The details were vivid, precise, and chilling. The way the bears moved, the sounds they made, the sheer size of them, and the almost palpable danger of being in such close proximity. I froze. My mind immediately started calculating worst-case scenarios. If a bear appeared near our camp tonight, how quickly could we react? How far was the nearest ranger station? Was our food secure enough to not attract one? The realistic danger of bears, animals that could end a human life in minutes, made my pulse race in a way that aliens never had. My rational brain told me that our group was careful, that we had hung food properly, that encounters were statistically rare. But none of that mattered in the moment. The images the others described, combined with the isolation of the backcountry at night, made my anxiety spike. Suddenly, I found myself begging for the topic to switch back to aliens. "Let's talk about aliens again," I muttered, almost pleadingly. For some reason, the idea of extraterrestrials felt safer than the realistic, tangible threat of bears. At least aliens weren't actually walking the forest near us, sniffing around our campsite, their massive claws capable of tearing through flesh. With aliens, the fear was distant, abstract, and safe in a way that the presence of bears was not. I decided to distract myself by scanning the surrounding woods, flashlight beams sweeping slowly across the trees. The shadows seemed unnaturally long in the flickering firelight, and every movement of leaves or branch made me jump slightly. The creek nearby murmured quietly, a low, continuous sound that should have been calming, but instead felt like a reminder of how isolated we were. The trail back to civilization was miles away, and the only sounds were those the forest chose to provide. As the conversation reluctantly returned to aliens, I focused on observing the night. I noticed small things I had overlooked before. The way a pine tree leaned slightly over the creek, casting a shadow that almost looked like a figure. The way the wind moved the branches, creating soft thumps against the forest floor. The occasional glimmer of an insect reflecting the firelight. My senses felt heightened, almost painfully so. Every snapping twig, every rustling leaf felt amplified, and I caught myself imagining a bear, huge and silent, moving just beyond the light's reach. I decided to move a few feet away from the fire, carefully adjusting my pack, and crouched slightly behind a small pine sapling. From this vantage point, I could see the creek more clearly and the forest beyond. My flashlight beam was unnecessary with the fire illuminating some of the clearing, but I kept it ready, feeling the instinctive urge to be prepared for anything. The forest felt alive in ways that daylight had hidden. The rustling of leaves, the distant crack of a branch, the soft thump of something moving in the underbrush. Every sound set my heart racing. Every shadow seemed to flicker with intention. Minutes passed. My breathing slowed slightly as I reminded myself of the preparation we had taken. Food hung high from trees, tents zipped and secured, bear spray within reach. Still, the tension lingered. I realized that this kind of fear, the awareness of potential danger mixed with isolation, was different from casual anxiety. It was precise, sharp, and unavoidable. Aliens were theoretical, a story, a distraction. Bears were real, and every sound or shadow in the forest suddenly felt like a warning. Eventually, I returned to the circle of hikers, the conversation continuing in low tones about strange lights, unexplained phenomena, and otherworldly sightings. Each time a bear story was mentioned, my stomach tightened. I could feel the sweat forming on my neck despite the cool air. My mind ran through countless what-if scenarios. A bear stepping into the clearing, hearing our voices, moving toward us. I imagined the chaos. People scattering, tents torn apart, the sound of claws on wood, my pack ripped open, the cold, sharp reality of being trapped in the forest with a predator. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to embers, and one by one, the group retreated to their tents, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat for a while, flashlight off, listening to the forest. The wind through the pines created a soft whisper, and the creek burbled gently. I allowed myself to imagine aliens again, distant lights in the sky or unknown phenomena beyond human comprehension. The fear felt safer this way, abstract and untouchable, not tangible and immediate like a bear. Eventually, sleep overtook me, though it was light and uneasy. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, caused my eyes to flick open. I kept my bear spray within reach, my pack zipped and close, my flashlight ready. The night felt endless, stretching every second with the weight of potential danger. Yet, by morning, the sun began to rise, casting warm light across the forest. Shadows shortened, the forest's textures became clear, and the creek sparkled. What had felt menacing in the darkness now seemed ordinary. During the hike back to civilization, I reflected on the night. The forest, even in daylight, retained its density and quiet, but the abstract fear of aliens now felt comforting compared to the very real threat of bears. I realized something important. Fear isn't about what is impossible. It's about what is immediate and unavoidable. We can debate UFOs endlessly and feel a thrill of the unknown, but a bear walking into a campsite is immediate, real, and demands respect and caution. By the time I reached the parking area, I felt a mix of relief and lingering tension. I had survived the night, fully aware of the forest's dangers, fully aware of how our perception of risk can shift with conversation and imagination. I knew that every time I returned to the backcountry, I would remember that night, the way fear could twist from one subject to another, how tangible threats demanded more attention than distant speculation, and how my instincts could guide me even when my mind wandered to stories and abstractions. The experience stayed with me long after the trip ended. Every time I hiked alone, I thought about the balance between imagination and reality, about how quickly conversation or thought could amplify fear, and about the lessons learned by facing the very real, immediate dangers of the wilderness. It shaped the way I approached future trips. More prepared, more alert, and more aware of the forest's quiet signals, knowing that sometimes the scariest things are not imagined or fictional, but very real and patiently waiting in the shadows. Even now, when I recall that night, I remember the forest in a way I never had before. The dim moonlight filtering through the pines, the sound of water in the creek, the carefully stacked piles of debris that lined the trail in places I had passed. I remember the moments when abstract fear, aliens, was safer than the tangible presence of wildlife. And I remember understanding, for the first time in a vivid, almost overwhelming way, that real danger doesn't need to be spectacular to be terrifying. It only needs to be real, close, and entirely within reach. I've always trusted my dog more than I trust myself when it comes to the outdoors. I've had her since she was a puppy, and over the years she's become more than just company on trails. She's an extra set of ears, a nose that catches what mine never could, and a kind of instinct I could never hope to match. I didn't realize just how much that mattered until the day she tipped me off to a mountain lion. It was late fall when it happened, one of those gray days where the light feels weak and thin even though the sun is still above the ridgeline. The air had that cold, sharp bite that hinted at the first snow not being far off. The trail I was hiking wasn't a new one. I'd been on it dozens of times, a loop that cut through a mixture of ponderosa pine and scrub oak, climbing up toward a ridge that gave a view of the valley. It wasn't one of the popular trails either, which was part of why I liked it. The path was narrow, weaving through gullies and across little streams, with long sections where you could walk for half an hour and not see another person. That day, the ground was damp from rain the night before. The dirt clung to my boots in heavy clumps, and the air carried that deep, earthy smell of wet leaves and pine needles. The forest was quiet in the way it sometimes is after weather passes through. Birds weren't calling much, and even the wind seemed muted, pushing only now and then through the tops of the trees. It gave the hike a hollow feeling, like sound itself didn't carry the way it normally did. My dog trotted ahead, as she always did, never straying too far but far enough to have space. She'd dart forward, nose to the ground, then circle back to check on me before pushing out again. Her body language was relaxed, tail loose, head down, ears flicking every so often. Watching her, I felt the same calm I always did at the start of a hike, that quiet rhythm of boot on dirt, breath in cold air. and the steady pace of moving forward. It was about halfway up the ridge when things started to change. My dog had stopped trotting and slowed into something more cautious. She wasn't stiff, not at first, but she wasn't carefree either. Her nose worked the ground harder, and she kept pausing to lift her head, scanning the brush. I've seen her do that before when deer are nearby or sometimes coyotes, so I didn't think much of it. I assumed maybe we were downwind of something and she'd caught a scent. The trail wound into a tighter section of oaks and willows, branches crowding the edges and hanging low enough that I had to duck in places. The ground here was soft, carpeted with wet leaves, and the smell of damp vegetation was stronger. It felt more enclosed than the earlier stretches. Less sky above me, more shadow all around. My dog froze ahead of me. Her body went rigid, tail raised, ears locked forward. I knew immediately it wasn't a deer. Deer make her excited. She prances, tail wagging, sometimes barking, wanting to give chase. This was different. She stood like a statue, one paw slightly lifted, eyes locked ahead into the brush. A low growl built in her chest, quiet but steady. I stopped too, every sense on high alert. My eyes scanned the trees, the undergrowth, every gap between branches. First, I saw nothing. The forest looked as it always did: brown trunks, tangled branches, patches of shadow where the light couldn't cut through. But my dog didn't move. That growl stayed, vibrating the air between us. Then I saw it. It wasn't obvious, not like in the movies where animals stand out against the backdrop. It was a shape, a subtle difference in color, tucked low between the willows maybe 30 yards ahead. Two golden eyes caught the weak light, unblinking, locked on us. For a second, my brain refused to put the pieces together. Then it did. The outline of the head, the low, crouched body, the stillness. It was a mountain lion. I'd read enough about them to know what I was looking at. The way it was crouched meant it had been watching us before I ever saw it. My stomach dropped, and the hairs on my arms stood up. It wasn't just the sight of it. It was the realization that this thing had been there silently, hidden, long enough for me to walk into its range without even knowing. The lion didn't move right away. It just stared, muscles coiled, tail barely twitching. My dog growled louder, pressing closer to my side now, hackles raised. I could feel the tension in her body, every muscle ready to spring. My mind scrambled through what I knew. Don't run. Running triggers the chase. Make yourself look bigger. Keep eye contact. Move slowly. All those bits of advice came rushing in, but none of it felt real standing there with the weight of those eyes on me. I forced myself to stay upright, chest out, trying to breathe steady even though every instinct screamed to turn and bolt. My dog pressed against my leg, her growl breaking into sharp, short bursts. I took a step backward, slow, deliberate. The lion's head followed the movement, eyes never leaving me. The forest was silent except for my dog. No bird calls, no rustle of squirrels. Just the sound of her warning growls and my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. I could see the muscles in the lion's shoulders shift slightly, that subtle ripple of power just under the skin. Could close the distance in seconds. I kept backing up, one step at a time, scanning the ground behind me so I didn't trip. My eyes flicked back constantly to those golden orbs in the brush. They blinked once, slow, deliberate, then locked again. It felt like it was weighing me, deciding if I was worth the effort. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute, the lion shifted. Not toward me, but sideways, melting deeper into the brush. One moment I could see the outline of its body, the curve of its back, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the willows. My dog's growl cut off instantly, replaced by frantic sniffing, darting back and forth, trying to track the scent. I couldn't see it anymore, and that was somehow worse. Not knowing where it was, whether it was circling, whether it was waiting for me to slip. I didn't turn my back. I kept walking backward, slow but steady, until I broke out of the thick willows and into a more open stretch of trail. My eyes scanned every ridgeline, every cluster of rocks, searching for movement. The forest stayed silent. It wasn't until I was nearly back to the trailhead, with the trees thinning and the first signs of open ground ahead, that I finally let myself breathe fully. My dog was still on edge, ears swiveling, body tense, but she wasn't growling anymore. The worst of it had passed, though the adrenaline coursing through me wouldn't let me calm down. When we reached the car, I opened the back and she jumped in immediately, curling into herself as if she'd just finished some massive task. I sat behind the wheel, staring out at the tree line for a long time before I could even think about driving away. The image of those golden eyes stayed with me for days. It wasn't just the fear, it was the knowledge that I never would have seen it if not for my dog. That lion had been there, watching, silent and invisible, until she picked up on it. Without her, I would have walked right into its range, oblivious, maybe never realizing how close I'd come. After that, I never underestimated her instincts again. Every pause, every stiffened stance, every sudden growl, I paid attention. Because out there, in the places where silence rules and shadows hide things better than you could ever imagine, sometimes the only warning you'll get comes from the animal walking beside you. And sometimes that warning is the only reason you make it home. I've always had this kind of complicated relationship with the outdoors. For years I thought I loved it, and maybe I still do, but there are certain moments burned into my memory that made me question if all the peaceful quiet, clean air, and views were really worth the way my body and mind sometimes get pushed to the edge. One of the clearest examples of that is a trip I took to the Adirondacks years ago with my ex. At the time, it just felt like another hiking trip gone wrong, another story of bad luck and bad timing. But later, when I pieced together what had really happened, I realized how close I came to pushing myself too far, to breaking down completely out there in the woods. It started in the spring. That's already a tricky time in the Adirondacks. The trails are half frozen in the mornings, muddy by midday, and often blocked with branches and blowdowns from the winter storms that no one has had time to clear yet. The air can be damp and raw, and even though the sun might peek out, the ground still carries the weight of the long, cold months. My ex and I had gone up there a few times before, actually, for years in a row. He always said it was a good way to reset, to get away from the grind. I always told myself I liked it too, but deep down, I think I wanted something easier. The kind of trip where you can walk to a cafe, sit down, and order a coffee instead of trudging through mud just to find a patch of ground to rest. The day before the hike, things were already off. We had eaten some greasy diner food at a spot we passed on the drive up, and it didn't sit well with me. By evening, I was doubled over in the bathroom of the cabin we rented, throwing up until my stomach was empty and sore. I barely slept that night, waking up in waves of nausea, sweating and rolling over, wishing the hours would just skip ahead. By morning, I was drained but trying to convince myself I'd bounce back. He seemed fine, already buzzing about which trail we'd take, talking about a loop around a lake that had a waterfall about halfway through. I didn't want to ruin the trip, so I nodded along, even though every part of me just wanted to stay in bed. We set out later than usual, probably around midday. The air was heavy, the kind of wet chill that creeps under your clothes. The trailhead was quiet, almost deserted. That made sense. It was early spring, not the high season, and most people probably didn't want to deal with the messy conditions. The first stretch wasn't too bad, though. It was one of those narrow dirt paths that hugged the lake's edge, lined with willows and bare-limbed trees just starting to show hints of green buds. The water looked cold and dark, and the ripples from the wind spread out across the surface in sharp little patterns. The silence was the first thing I really noticed. Usually on hikes like this you hear chatter from other groups, maybe a dog barking in the distance, or the clatter of someone's trekking poles hitting rocks. This time, it was just us and the sound of our boots squelching in the mud, plus the occasional bird call that echoed through the woods. It should have felt peaceful, but instead it made the trail feel abandoned, almost too quiet, like we had stepped into a place we didn't quite belong. We got about halfway around when the path began to climb a little. That's when I remembered he had mentioned a waterfall. I was moving slowly, dragging my feet more than I wanted to admit, when it happened. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A low, heavy rumbling sound somewhere ahead. It didn't sound like water. It was deeper, almost like the ground itself was vibrating. My chest tightened immediately. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It felt alive. like some huge thing was stomping the ground. I froze, looking ahead into the tangled mess of branches and brush. The sound kept coming, like a steady pounding that grew louder. My stomach, already weak from the food poisoning, flipped over again. Before I could even make sense of it, I heard this noise, this rapid, throaty growl that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard in the woods before. It wasn't like a bear or a moose. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It sounded wrong, almost like something out of a movie, one of those alien sound effects that ramps up in speed and volume until it rattles your whole body. My chest locked up. Without even thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My boots pounded the wet earth, slipping and catching on roots. My breath came out in short gasps, and I could feel tears pushing at the corners of my eyes. Every nerve in me screamed that something was barreling down on us, something I couldn't fight and couldn't reason with. I don't know how long I ran before I stopped. Long enough that my lungs were burning, and my vision blurred from panic. When I finally looked back, the trail was empty. There was no beast charging after us, no massive shadow pushing through the brush. But I couldn't shake the sound. That growl was still in my ears, rising and falling like it had sunk straight into my bones. Going back the way we came wasn't an option for me. I refused. I didn't care what it meant. The thought of retracing those steps, of going back past the place where that sound had risen out of the ground, made me sick. My ex tried to reason with me, but I was locked in. The only way forward was to cut off the trail and push through the boggy stretch of land that curved around to meet the far side of the loop. That part was worse than the trail. The ground was saturated, sucking at our boots with every step. Half the time it felt like the mud was trying to pull me under. My legs were shaking from exhaustion, and the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves was so strong it coated my throat. My boots came loose more than once, nearly yanking off my feet. By the time we finally pushed through to the far side and saw the faint outline of the path again, I was soaked up to my knees and trembling. When we reached the car, I broke down completely. I was shaking so hard I could barely get the key into the lock. I sat inside, gripping the steering wheel even though I wasn't the one driving, tears running down my face. My whole body felt raw, like my nerves had been stripped bare. It wasn't just fear. It was everything: the sickness from the day before, the quiet, the isolation, and then that sound. I couldn't make sense of it. I remember saying, almost without thinking, that the next vacation would be somewhere in a city. I meant it too. I was done with the Adirondacks. After 4 years of trips up there, that was the one that finally beat me down. It wasn't just a bad experience, it was the kind that leaves a mark, the kind that makes you question why you ever stepped out there in the first place. For years afterward, I avoided even thinking about that day. But then one night, years later, I was sitting at home scrolling through the internet, playing background sounds to help me relax. I came across a playlist of forest sounds, and without thinking, I let it play. At first, it was calming. Birds chirping, water flowing, wind moving through leaves. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. That same rising, throaty growl that had sent me running. My stomach dropped instantly, and a cold shiver ran straight through me. I froze in my chair. My body knew before my mind did. The sound brought me right back to that trail, to the mud under my boots, to the way my chest locked up. When I finally read the description, I realized what it was. A ruffed grouse, just a bird, beating its wings against its chest during mating season, producing a drumming sound that escalates like a growl. That was it. That was the monster that had chased me in my mind for years. A bird trying to attract a mate. It's funny in a way, but at the same time, it isn't. Because in that moment, out there in the woods, I had no way of knowing. My body reacted like it was life or death. And honestly, that's what survival feels like sometimes. It's messy. It's overblown. Tricks you into running until your lungs give out, just because a sound echoes through the trees the wrong way. Even now, I can't laugh about it. I know the truth, and I know it wasn't a predator. But I also know what it felt like, and that's the part that stays with me. It taught me something about fear, that it doesn't matter if the danger is real or imagined. Once it gets inside you, it can take control and push you farther than you thought possible. That was the last time I hiked in the Adirondacks. And honestly, I think it always will be. I've always had this kind of complicated relationship with the outdoors. For years I thought I loved it, and maybe I still do, but there are certain moments burned into my memory that made me question if all the peaceful quiet, clean air, and views were really worth the way my body and mind sometimes get pushed to the edge. One of the clearest examples of that is a trip I took to the Adirondacks years ago with my ex. At the time, it just felt like another hiking trip gone wrong, another story of bad luck and bad timing. But later, when I pieced together what had really happened, I realized how close I came to pushing myself too far, to breaking down completely out there in the woods. It started in the spring. That's already a tricky time in the Adirondacks. The trails are half frozen in the mornings, muddy by midday, and often blocked with branches and blowdowns from the winter storms that no one has had time to clear yet. The air can be damp and raw, and even though the sun might peek out, the ground still carries the weight of the long, cold months. My ex and I had gone up there a few times before, actually, for years in a row. He always said it was a good way to reset, to get away from the grind. I always told myself I liked it too, but deep down, I think I wanted something easier. The kind of trip where you can walk to a cafe, sit down, and order a coffee instead of trudging through mud just to find a patch of ground to rest. The day before the hike, things were already off. We had eaten some greasy diner food at a spot we passed on the drive up, and it didn't sit well with me. By evening, I was doubled over in the bathroom of the cabin we rented, throwing up until my stomach was empty and sore. I barely slept that night, waking up in waves of nausea, sweating and rolling over, wishing the hours would just skip ahead. By morning, I was drained but trying to convince myself I'd bounce back. He seemed fine, already buzzing about which trail we'd take, talking about a loop around a lake that had a waterfall about halfway through. I didn't want to ruin the trip, so I nodded along, even though every part of me just wanted to stay in bed. We set out later than usual, probably around midday. The air was heavy, the kind of wet chill that creeps under your clothes. The trailhead was quiet, almost deserted. That made sense. It was early spring, not the high season, and most people probably didn't want to deal with the messy conditions. The first stretch wasn't too bad, though. It was one of those narrow dirt paths that hugged the lake's edge, lined with willows and bare-limbed trees just starting to show hints of green buds. The water looked cold and dark, and the ripples from the wind spread out across the surface in sharp little patterns. The silence was the first thing I really noticed. Usually on hikes like this you hear chatter from other groups, maybe a dog barking in the distance, or the clatter of someone's trekking poles hitting rocks. This time, it was just us and the sound of our boots squelching in the mud, plus the occasional bird call that echoed through the woods. It should have felt peaceful, but instead it made the trail feel abandoned, almost too quiet, like we had stepped into a place we didn't quite belong. We got about halfway around when the path began to climb a little. That's when I remembered he had mentioned a waterfall. I was moving slowly, dragging my feet more than I wanted to admit, when it happened. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A low, heavy rumbling sound somewhere ahead. It didn't sound like water. It was deeper, almost like the ground itself was vibrating. My chest tightened immediately. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't wind. It felt alive, like some huge thing was stomping the ground. I froze, looking ahead into the tangled mess of branches and brush. The sound kept coming, like a steady pounding that grew louder. My stomach, already weak from the food poisoning, flipped over again. Before I could even make sense of it, I heard this noise, this rapid, throaty growl that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard in the woods before. It wasn't like a bear or a moose. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It sounded wrong, almost like something out of a movie, one of those alien sound effects that ramps up in speed and volume until it rattles your whole body. My chest locked up. Without even thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My boots pounded the wet earth, slipping and catching on roots. My breath came out in short gasps, and I could feel tears pushing at the corners of my eyes. Every nerve in me screamed that something was barreling down on us, something I couldn't fight and couldn't reason with. I don't know how long I ran before I stopped. Long enough that my lungs were burning and my vision blurred from panic. When I finally looked back, the trail was empty. There was no beast charging after us, no massive shadow pushing through the brush. But I couldn't shake the sound. That growl was still in my ears, rising and falling like it had sunk straight into my bones. Going back the way we came wasn't an option for me. I refused. I didn't care what it meant. The thought of retracing those steps, of going back past the place where that sound had risen out of the ground, made me sick. My ex tried to reason with me, but I was locked in. The only way forward was to cut off the trail and push through the boggy stretch of land that curved around to meet the far side of the loop. That part was worse than the trail. The ground was saturated, sucking at our boots with every step. Half the time it felt like the mud was trying to pull me under. My legs were shaking from exhaustion, and the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves was so strong it coated my throat. My boots came loose more than once, nearly yanking off my feet. By the time we finally pushed through to the far side and saw the faint outline of the path again, I was soaked up to my knees and trembling. When we reached the car, I broke down completely. I was shaking so hard I could barely get the key into the lock. I sat inside, gripping the steering wheel even though I wasn't the one driving, tears running down my face. My whole body felt raw, like my nerves had been stripped bare. It wasn't just fear. It was everything: the sickness from the day before, the quiet, the isolation, and then that sound. I couldn't make sense of it. I remember saying, almost without thinking, that the next vacation would be somewhere in a city. I meant it too. I was done with the Adirondacks. After 4 years of trips up there, that was the one that finally beat me down. It wasn't just a bad experience, it was the kind that leaves a mark, the kind that makes you question why you ever stepped out there in the first place. For years afterward, I avoided even thinking about that day. But then one night, years later, I was sitting at home scrolling through the internet, playing background sounds to help me relax. I came across a playlist of forest sounds, and without thinking, I let it play. At first, it was calming. Birds chirping, water flowing, wind moving through leaves. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. That same rising, throaty growl that had sent me running. My stomach dropped instantly, and a cold shiver ran straight through me. I froze in my chair. My body knew before my mind did. The sound brought me right back to that trail, to the mud under my boots, to the way my chest locked up. When I finally read the description, I realized what it was. A ruffed grouse, just a bird, beating its wings against its chest during mating season, producing a drumming sound that escalates like a growl. That was it. That was the monster that had chased me in my mind for years. A bird trying to attract a mate. It's funny in a way, but at the same time, it isn't. Because in that moment, out there in the woods, I had no way of knowing. My body reacted like it was life or death, and honestly, that's what survival feels like sometimes. It's messy, it's overblown, tricks you into running until your lungs give out, just because a sound echoes through the trees the wrong way. Even now, I can't laugh about it. I know the truth, and I know it wasn't a predator. But I also know what it felt like, and that's the part that stays with me. It taught me something about fear, that it doesn't matter if the danger is real or imagined. Once it gets inside you, it can take control and push you farther than you thought possible. That was the last time I hiked in the Adirondacks. And honestly, I think it always will be.